So today we're discussing contracts. Buyers and sellers, you'll want to know about this stuff. So in residential real estate, we work with two main contracts. There are the particulars and conditions of sale by auction, and there's the sale and purchase agreement, which is if you're going to do a conditional offer, that's the one you'll use. So look, we won't get into the method of sales too much today, and we'll just cover it a little bit broadly. But really the one we're going to concentrate on today is the sale and purchase agreement. So if you've got a conditional offer. So for sellers, it's when you know what you're going to work with, and for buyers, it's what conditions are you going to put in. And it comes down to risk, right? So there are 6 main conditions on the front page, which is down the bottom here. So speaking of the front page, that covers off your offer amount. It covers off the deposit you want to pay. Generally it's 10%, but as a buyer it can actually be whatever you like. So, you know, look, as sellers want to see a real commitment there. So a deposit amount of $1,000 is probably not going to do it. 10% of your purchase price is quite a good amount. The main reason being is that if you actually go unconditional on a contract and you fail to settle, you lose that deposit as a buyer. So the seller gets it, less any fees for the agents, and then they can sell the house again. So you want to have an amount that's a pretty serious commitment from your point of view, and that the seller's going to take seriously. Otherwise, some alarm bells can start to ring, really. So and moving down the page, then we've got the date that it's unconditional, which is generally tied to the conditions you've got in the contract, and then the settlement date, which you ask for, or the seller determines what that's going to be, and that can be another point of negotiation as well. And then getting down to the bottom part of the page, which are the 6 conditions, and the 3 main ones that we work with are the finance condition, the council lim, and building inspection report. So sometimes you'll see the conditions are slotted in at the start. There'll be an escape clause or something like that put in the further terms of sale. So that's all to do with the level of risk. So, you know, how I look at it is any condition that's on the front page of the contract is pretty standard. So if you're a conditional buyer, you need finance. If your broker or your bank is talking to you about it, then you're probably going to need the lim, and you may or may not need a building inspection report, and they're all tied into finance. So you can't really have one without the other, or the two being lim and builders without the finance. So that they sort of all match up. And we don't want to waste your money or your time, so sometimes those conditions are all the same days. So basically, if you know that your finance is going to take you 10 or 15, maybe even 20 working days, then it makes sense that the lim and builders report is the same time frame. So your solicitor is working through and is going to agree to all those conditions at the same time, because the more work the lawyer or the solicitor puts into your agreement, they're going to charge you. So every time they pick it up and look at it, every time they do something for you, you'll probably be charged for that. Some not, and not always, but just something else to be aware of as well. Now sellers, from your point of view, you get an offer on your property. Sometimes it goes to multiple offer, and same again, we'll talk about that in another video. But so let's say we're just dealing with one offer at the moment. So we've got our offer. We've got the standard conditions on the front, so we say we've got finance, lim, and builders. What else are we going to have? Because what it comes down to from when I'm working with sellers and we've got an offer from a buyer, it's transferring the risk. It's the level of risk that the seller has to accept. So, you know, we even ask around if the buyers are pre-approved with their finance and the bank just wants to see the lim to make sure there's no problems there. That's still a little bit of risk there, but it's a pretty solid offer. If they've got the building inspection report in as well and we don't have one available, then who knows, right? I hate surprises. So the only surprise I want is my 50th birthday party, which is coming up in a couple of years. But look, the more information we know from the seller's point of view, and as agents, we're working for the sellers, so both of us ideally want all the information we can possibly get, so that it drives me nuts that buyers could have more information on the property than you do as a seller or as an agent. So absolutely, LIM and building inspection report are done up front for me, so that we have the same information that buyers have. And also as a seller, if your building inspection report comes back that maybe the roof needs a little tidy up or something like that, you can do it, or you can adjust your asking price to take care of those works that may need to be done, or that the buyer's going to have to take care of. So those are the certain things around it. So no surprises from a seller's point of view, and minimising the level of risk that a buyer is trying to give to you, because that's what a conditional offer is. It's a bunch of risk, right? So anyway, main three: finance, LIM, builders. We've sort of covered that off. And then we go to the other page, which is the further terms of sale. So there's all the standard conditions, and you want to make sure that stuff like the title requisition and things like that are not crossed off, because that can also create problems. And you know, the Auckland District Law Society and Real Estate Institute have made this sale and purchase agreement with all the standard clauses for a reason, so we don't like to change those too much. So the further terms is where you as a buyer are able to put in other things. So let's say you've found your dream home, but you need to sell your current house first. And even that has levels of risk to it. So you found your dream house, you came to the open home, you've sort of talked to your broker and everything, you've got a fair idea, but you haven't got your house on the market yet. So you love this house, but you need to sell your current house and it's not even on the market. So that is a level of risk that is relatively high. It's quite different if you've been on the market and you yourself are under contract with your property and you're due to go unconditional in a week, and then you put an offer together subject to the sale of your house. The risk is much lower because you're under contract and you're going to go unconditional. So there's still a chance it doesn't work out, but if it goes unconditional in the next week or so, then our deal we're working with, we've got a week to figure out what's going to happen. So that's not too bad. It's still a little bit of risk, but it's not as much as you find your dream home as a buyer and you have to put your house on the market, and you're expecting the seller to take it as it is. So we're going to balance out that risk, right? The other one I want to talk about that's probably the worst condition you can add in as a buyer. And understand, if your solicitor advises you to do it, then they're trying to protect you, right? So your buyer and their solicitor are working, you know, the solicitor for the buyer is working to protect the buyer. The solicitor for the seller is working to protect the seller. And us as agents are trying to conclude a deal and the transaction and get to some middle ground and work for the deal. So it's great that both parties are protected, but sometimes that doesn't mean the deal can be done as smooth as possible or in a way that the buyer and the seller would like. So we just have to be wary of that as well. So look, a due diligence clause can sound good from a buyer's point of view because there's certain things that you want to check out. But here's the tip. As a buyer, be specific. If you just want to check out the condition of the ground because you're wanting to do extensions or something like that, it would be much better to put a specific clause in relating to a geotech report or subject to your builder approving the alterations that you want to make, etc., rather than just putting on a due diligence clause and leaving that open for 5, 10, 15 plus days, because you can pull out of a contract as a buyer for absolutely any reason at all. If you just have the standard due diligence clause in a contract, you don't like the colour of the door, or the carpet's a bit worn more than you realised, or the grass is too long, fence is the wrong colour, whatever, you can pull out of a deal. If you've got a due diligence contract condition in your contract, you can pull out of it for whatever reason within that time frame. So as a seller, and unless you're a true buyer's agent being paid by a buyer, every agent has a fiduciary and legal obligation to work in the seller's best interest while treating you as a buyer fairly. So from me advising my sellers, it's got the due diligence clause in there. We're going to counteract that by putting in an escape clause or a cash out clause, which is commonly known. So hey, look, we'll agree to your offer. We'll agree to the terms, the money's right, the settlement date's okay. We don't like the due diligence clause because there's a level of risk that's just too high for us. So we're going to put in an escape clause, which means that if another offer comes along that the seller considers to be better, then you have Super aggressive is 3 working days. I don't really advise that to my clients. So look, 5 or 10 working days as a escape clause basically then combats the due diligence and also the subject to your house condition. So think of it as just balancing it out, right? So you've given us an offer with a certain amount of risk that we're not entirely comfortable with. So as a seller, we're going to accept your offer by putting in a clause for us that if something better comes along, we'll still work with you. So that's sometimes a little bit of a misunderstanding out there when you're doing a deal. An escape clause or a cash out clause doesn't mean as soon as another offer comes along you miss out. It means that you have a certain amount of time to meet all your conditions. So if you've got your due diligence, subject to house sale, finance, limb builders, all of that stuff, and let's say the longest condition you've got is 4 weeks to get a sale on your house. If a week goes by, you're under contract, and we run another open home because we're still marketing the property until it's sold. Until you actually go unconditional on a contract, we're working for the sellers because it's not sold until it's sold. Until it's unconditional, that's when the sold sticker goes up. So there may be times where there's open homes and private viewings and things, even though you're under contract. And yes, it can be frustrating as the buyer that's committed to the property and gone under contract, but you've got conditions. So we need to keep working for the seller and make sure that if there is a better offer out there, we've exposed the property to it and we've talked to everybody about it. So let's say you've got 4 weeks to sell your house. All the other conditions are pretty standard, so we're okay there. And then after a week, you get notice that someone's come through, they've just sold their house. It could be in Auckland or situation, real estate's always changing. So people are buyers and sellers always coming in and out of the market. So, especially an auction result, that takes the best buyer out of the market on that day because they've just bought a house. The next best buyer is the underbidder of that property. So say they missed out on that property on the auction on Friday, they come back to the open home on Sunday. Look, Paul, this wasn't our favourite, but we really like it and we have to buy something now because we've sold our house and we missed out at auction on Friday, so we'd like to put an offer in on this one. Hey, it is under contract, but there is an escape clause in the current contract, so there is an opportunity for you. What are your conditions? Okay, well, we just want our builder to look at it and we're cash buyers, so we're happy with everything else. So we write that one up and then we enact the escape clause on the original contract. So it doesn't mean you've missed out, it means you now have the clock ticking even faster than your normal conditions because the escape clause has been enacted. So you've got 5 or 10 working days to make sure you're unconditional on everything. So it can feel unfair, but it is actually quite fair because you've gone under contract with all these conditions and it's up to you to meet them. And then if something better comes along before you go unconditional, working for the seller, we're obligated to give them the options, right? So sometimes you're able to become unconditional early and you own the house. Sometimes you can't and the other offer comes into play. Your offer is at an end after the 5 or 10 working days of the escape clause if you haven't managed to meet all your other conditions, and unfortunately you miss out and the house gets sold to the other offer. So that's what I mean about the level of risk. So, obviously take into consideration your advice from your solicitor and other professionals, and like we've talked about a little bit, we'll talk about multi-offers and things like that a little bit further in other videos, but I never recommend removing conditions just to make your offer better if you're going into a multi-offer situation, because there's a reason you wanted those conditions in the first place. It protects you as a buyer. But you've got to understand there's a level of risk that the seller's going to look at with our advisement, and that's how we'll make decisions on which offer to work with. So sometimes we'll ask if you can shorten down certain conditions just to make it a bit better, and sometimes, especially the due diligence clause, there's not much you can do if you're subject to selling your house because you don't know how long that's going to take unless you're already under contract. So not much you can do there, but the due diligence clause especially, we're going to ask to be more specific around that or to remove it completely. Because if you've got your finance and your limb report from council and your building inspection report, what else do you need to look at? It's not lazy, but it's a bit of a cover-all type clause that not particularly great. So you can show your commitment to the property as a buyer by being really clear on what conditions you're going to use and being really specific around what it is that you want to do. So that way the seller's like, well, this guy's pretty serious, you know, he just wants those main conditions on the front page, and then he's got 5 days for an engineer to come and check something out. That's a lot better than having a due diligence clause in the contract, basically. Yeah, and look, that's the long and short of it. There is another couple of things in the contracts to be aware of. We covered it briefly early on, but the main thing is, from a buyer's point of view, if you do get under contract and you go unconditional and you pay your deposit, and for whatever reason you don't settle, you lose your deposit. So that is probably the biggest little catch to be aware of. But look, it doesn't happen very often. You just read about it sometimes with bigger developers on big projects, so that, you know, just at the end of the day they just couldn't get the deal together and it didn't work out. Another situation might be if you end up in jail. So if you bought the house, you go unconditional, you did something stupid, and you can't settle on the property. So unfortunately life's just going to get a whole lot worse. Not only are you in jail, you're going to lose your deposit on the property that you couldn't settle on as well. But there's ways to protect you around that also, which is why, you know, when you put your name on the contract, if it's not going to be just you, if it's you and your partner, but your partner isn't available, you leave the little wording called and or nominee, you leave that open, you don't cross it out, because that enables you to put somebody else's name on the contract prior to settlement so that you can cover it off. So there's certain things that we want to talk about to buyers to make sure they understand everything and that they have a level of protection. And the main reason and the main way that buyers are protected is through their conditions. But look, as working for the sellers the vast majority of the time and trying to get the best deal possible for them, not always the most money, that's obviously important, but the best deal, we're going to ask the questions around these conditions and why they're in there and what they're needed for and things like that, but also making sure that you feel that it's a fair offer from your point of view as a buyer and you've got levels of protection in there by way of your conditions. Then we can take that to the seller, and if there's certain things that aren't quite right, very rarely does an offer get presented and the seller just signs it straight away and they're totally happy. Does happen, makes the job a little bit easier, but look, generally there's lots of negotiating points. You know, obviously the asking price is one, that's probably the biggest one. The deposit amount can be changed as well, and also then the settlement date. So especially what we find a lot of the time is older people are going into care facilities or retirement villages and they have a certain date they need to be moved in by. So that's not as flexible as other situations. So the settlement date can be used as a negotiating tool, as well as the deposit amount and as well as obviously the asking price. And then also shortening your conditions if possible and removing some of those ones that may or may not be necessary, or just rewording them in such a way that it's very clear around what you're trying to do as a buyer. Look, that's covered that off, and what we're going to do with the Spilling the Beans series is talk about all sorts of things in real estate, but basically this is Spilling the Beans, where I answer the real estate questions you're too polite to ask. So if you've found this helpful, please like and subscribe to the channel, and feel free to forward this on to anyone else you might see value in, because we're going to do a whole bunch of videos. We're going to talk about all sorts of things, so there's going to be nothing that I don't cover. Sometimes it's going to be a bunch of questions that I've had at open homes or when I sit down with sellers, and I'm just going to answer them so more people can get informed about everything before you start coming to open homes. And otherwise, some of the tips and tricks might be things you haven't even thought about that may or may not be fair in the real estate game, and I just want you to know about those things. So thanks for checking this out. Be well, and we'll catch up again soon. Cheers.